Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the RMS Titanic. And I plan on doing a series of little talks on bits and pieces of Titanic history and things that don't get covered as much as perhaps they should. And what I wanted to talk about today is how the media had a profound effect upon the disaster. Now, granted, we have to remember, and it's often not stated, that when the Titanic sailed in 1912, it was following a very successful run of her sister, the Olympic. The Olympic was in the press constantly. Scientific American, New York Times, every type of newspaper, magazine had stories about the RMS Olympic, the ship of wonder, and everything else. And so the Titanic had to come in and follow that. And it was not an easy act to follow. And therefore, if you notice, and maybe you won't because a lot of people don't look at papers of the time, the Titanic got little press because basically everyone was talking about the Olympic, which was basically the same ship as the Titanic was. Now, the thing that's most fascinating is that the Titanic got some press and got talked about here and there, and really didn't get talked about tremendously until it sank. And then, of course, it was a non-stop frenzy. And any story, any tale, no matter how fanciful, no matter how amazing, and no matter how incredibly ridiculous it was fair game for the press. And the press talked about it all. There were people a half-mile away from the ship as it was sinking, in the darkness, talking about watching people shake hands. I mean, figure this stuff out. It was in the press. And then came the ambulance chasers. Now, it was a fellow by the name of Marshall Everett, or Everett Marshall. He used both names because he wrote books using both names to sell more books. And it was the disaster of the RMS Titanic, the sinking of the RMS Titanic, the tragedy of the RMS Titanic. He sold thousands and thousands and thousands of books. Were they accurate? No, they didn't have to be accurate. It was all sensationalism. And the unfortunate part of sensationalism, it sometimes sticks around. And a lot of the stories that came out in 1912 through the press, through the ambulance chaser books, have stayed with us to this very day, trying to break a record. Of course, it was impossible. The Titanic, if she was truly pressed, and everything was pushed into the boilers, maybe she could in spurts reach 25 knots. And that would be pushing it tremendously. Comfortably, she could do 22, 23 knots. But that's not a speed to break a record. You have to remember, you had the Mauretania and the Lusitania. They were much faster than the Titanic and much more powerful. But with the Titanic became sensationalism. And the stories went on, and they talked about this and that. And suddenly, the disaster took on dimensions that no one could have ever thought of the day before the Titanic sank. So what we had to do, in studying the Titanic and writing about the Titanic and talking about the Titanic, was trying to sift fact from fiction. And years ago, that was very difficult because a lot of information was not available. But some of the greatest information would come out during the trials in New York and in Washington, D.C., after the sinking. and of course in the Board of Trade, which was somewhat less open about a lot of stuff because it was run by the Board of Trade, and one has to remember that the lifeboat law was by the Board of Trade. So the Board of Trade was not going to go out of its way to condemn itself. But in New York and in Washington, D.C., Senator Smith, I believe he was from Michigan, he headed up the committee to do an investigation on the Titanic. And it was quite a thorough and interesting investigation, although lambasted by many. Basically because he asked questions like such questions as, what is an iceberg made of? And some wag answered, ice. Of course, he was wanting to find out if there were rocks and other things within the ice. But the thing is that in these newspaper accounts, in these books that were written, is an awful lot of misinformation, a lot of sensationalism, and one thing that's lacking in almost all of it is facts. And that hurt the whole story of the Titanic. And to this day, it has affected the story of the Titanic. I think through all the investigations done in the last 30-some-odd years by researchers and archivists and historians and armchair researchers, that a great deal of facts have come in that have totally changed the story. That as you talk to someone in 1950 about the Titanic, and you talk to someone today, our understandings would be totally different, because today we understand a lot more, and the discovery of the wreck in 1985 has added a great deal of information through not only our visual observance of it, but many of the artifacts that have been brought up from the wreck itself. That's all aided in our understanding of it. That's about all I wanted to talk about now. We'll talk more about the Titanic soon. Have a great day.